stuff following me. So, is it recording? Yeah. Okay. So the Roman Catholic Church, in a sense, said the Bible derives its authority from us, and we will interpret the Bible for the people. Now, this makes a lot of sense given the history of the Roman Catholic Church in the West, and the barbarian invasions, and levels of literacy after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, and then the Middle Ages, where, I mean, with the barbarian invasions and the collapse of the Roman Empire, the church was the only institution standing. And so Western monks converted the tribes to Christianity. It's in that period that, for the first time, Christianity becomes a religion of white Western people. This is between 500 and 1500 AD, where Christianity gets into the West. And the monasteries preserve learning, preserve education, preserve the books, and the monasteries really become the preservation of culture in the West. You know, once the Roman Empire collapses and then the West is Christianized in this period of about 1,000 years. And what the church does is the church sets up a sacramental system which really the church creates a culture in the West that is so thoroughly part of this world and thoroughly Christian, and this is then the culture that in the Age of Discovery will go out through the rest of the world. But at the heart of it is this assertion that, well, the Bible is an expression of the church. Well, I got to really shorthand a whole lot of critical history here. But what happens towards the end of the Middle Ages is that the Renaissance comes along, and part of what happens because of the Crusades is that these crusaders go into the East, and the eyes of the West are open to the world of the East. And so suddenly the West has access to Plato and Aristotle and the Greeks and some of the lost antiquity of Rome. And there's this huge movement in the West back to the sources. And so the West is enamored by a lot of what it's discovering in the East. And this movement to the sources starts with a conversation about the Bible, because what happened very early, around 600, was that the Bible was translated into Latin, and that's called the Vulgate. And this became the Bible in the West. Everything was done in Latin. Well, towards the end of the Middle Ages, after the Crusades, with the rise of wealth in Italy and the Renaissance going on, scholars in the Roman Catholic Church, one of the most predominant ones, Erasmus starts comparing the Greek New Testament to the Vulgate. And, well, things don't always match up so good. And Europe begins to say, hey, wait a minute. Shouldn't we update this? Well, there are still churches today that will say, don't touch the King James Bible. The King James Bible is the Bible. You know, God gave us the Bible. The King James Bible fell out of heaven and landed here on English-speaking earth and gave us the King James Bible. Well, the Vulgate was way more foundational than that. But Erasmus starts saying, you know, Jerome, for the masterpiece that the Vulgate was, didn't get everything right. And some of the things he got wrong impact some of our doctrines. We need to talk about this. Well, why didn't they want to talk about this?
They didn't want to change what they had done.
Right. The Roman Catholic Church is looking at this, you know, millions of people and their entire system that they've constructed and said, we can't just start tinkering with this stuff. And Erasmus is a scholar, well, we'll just have us academics talk about it.
Okay. Well, but scholars all over Europe are reading Erasmus and
looking at the Vulgate and noticing the problems, because, you know, what happens at the beginning of the 16th century? A technological disruption. Gutenberg printing press. You know the first book that was printed? The Bible. You know what language it was written in?
German.
The first Bible? Latin, Vulgate. Gutenberg's Bible. It'd be in Latin, because everybody spoke Latin. Latin was the language of the West. Yeah, everybody had their own little tribal languages, but anyone who wanted to connect between tribes, you spoke Latin. Latin is the language of the church. Latin is the language of diplomacy. This endured all the way into the 19th and 20th century.
And so scholars are reading Erasmus, and they're
seeing the deficiencies of the Vulgate, and they're talking about it.
Well, there's one scholar, I won't go into too much, Martin Luther,
in Germany, and he's a bright young man. And he's following Erasmus carefully, and he's seeing the deficiencies in the Vulgate, but he's also seeing some of the issues going on in the Roman Catholic Church, and if you go into the history of the Reformation, indulgences, and Martin Luther's reading the New Testament in Greek. And he's saying, there's issues with the Vulgate, and there's issues with our theology, and we need to have a conversation about it. So he writes his famous 95 Theses, and he guess what language he wrote those 95 Theses in? Latin. Some of his students, and you can get a sense of the internet here, some of his students took his 95 Theses, translated them into German, and printed them and passed them out. Luther wanted to start a conversation, an academic conversation about a number of theological things, but very quickly his ideas start to spread. And Martin Luther temperamentally was the kind of guy, and you've all known people like this, you know, nice guy, but if you push him, he pushes back. So he does this, and he said some sensitive things that got some people in the Roman Catholic Church a little upset, and generally the practice was, well, we don't let people talk like this, so Luther, you need to shut up. Well, just like he said, well, don't tell me to shut up. I'm right. I've got the Bible here. I've got the Greek text, and I'm right. No, the church, Mother Church, is telling you to be quiet. Well, Mother Church has to answer to the Bible. There's the move. Does the Bible answer to the church? Or does the church answer to the Bible? Martin Luther says, I have history on my side. The Bible was in Greek before it was in Latin. Some of these Latin translations are wrong. That has implications theologically for us. We need to change our practice and maybe even some of our doctrines. And so the church keeps pushing. Martin keeps pushing back. Martin's in the Holy... If Martin had lived in France or Italy, he'd been dead, and then nothing would have ever happened. But he lived in the Holy Roman Empire, which was neither holy nor Roman, and his particular little prince didn't want to see his star scholar get killed by the church, and so he kidnaps his own guy and smuggles him off in a castle and says, no, you're not touching Martin. So now Martin has to sit around. But what does the scholar do when he's got... He doesn't have to teach classes anymore. He doesn't have students. What does the scholar do if you lock him up in a castle?
Start a YouTube channel?
He writes. Well, one of the things he writes is a new version of the Bible in German. And he keeps writing his book. I mean, his feud with the Roman Catholic Church kept escalating. And he said, well, you know, I'm right, they're wrong. They should admit it. Church isn't going to admit it.
Well, and then Martin basically has this idea, and again, Alistair McGrath is a terrific guy to read about this. Also has a good book on this. Martin basically said, hey, here's the Bible. I'm going to read the Bible, and I'm a smart scholar. No, he's a great scholar. I'm going to read the Bible, and then from the Bible, I'm going to have truth, and I'm going to start to reform the church.
And so Martin and some of his people around him start reforming the church. And he thought, we'll reform the whole church based on the Bible, and we'll have one church. Cool. Well, Martin was reading the Bible, and Martin had a lot of ideas about how the church should be. Karlstadt and others, a bunch of other people started reading the Bible too. Guess what?
They had their own ideas.
They have their own ideas about how the church should be. And, you know, some of the ideas they held in common, but some of the ideas were in different ways. And so, because of the politics, the economics, because of a whole number of things, what happens is that the church fractures in the West. And the church fractured along governmental lines often. So in places, well, Italy was a patchwork at this point still, and we won't get into Italy because that doesn't get sorted out until the 19th century. Germany doesn't get sorted out until the 19th century, but France and Spain and England have some political cohesion, and so France and Spain stay Catholic. England is going to fight about this for the next few hundred years, swinging back and forth. And the patchwork parts of Europe, which is Italy, Switzerland, and Germany, are all going to get fractured into these tiny little groups that all have their own religion. And then in order to kind of satisfy everything, the rule is this. If you're the prince over an area, you get to pick the religion. So if I'm the king of Sacramento, I say, everybody in Sacramento is Christian Reformed. Everybody has to go to church on Sunday. Well, what if twice? David knows of what he speaks. Now, what if you live in Sacramento and you're Roman Catholic? What are your options? Move. That's exactly what people did. They move. But let's say I die and my son Philip says, Christian Reformed, it's kind of restrictive. I kind of like those wafers they serve at Mass. So Sacramento's going to be Catholic now. Well, what do you do then? Move again.
Yeah.
Well, but people have jobs and lives and country, and so this is a mess. And so this is a mess in Europe for a long time, and there are bloody wars that get fought over this. And England has all kinds of wars over this. And so what happens out of this is, and then the Roman Catholic Church has the Council of Trent to try and, because Martin Luther was pointing out some really big problems in the Roman Catholic Church, and because of the Reformation, the Roman Catholic Church had to do some reformation of their own, which they did. So in a sense, Luther did, in fact, achieve his goal, which was reforming the Roman Catholic Church, but not necessarily according to what he thought. But here's the problem. You had all of these people looking at the same Bible and coming up with different answers. One word we would use of this today is pluralism. Well, what's the truth? There isn't, well, there can be four truths, kind of, but elemental to the idea of truth is that there's one. So what is the truth about God? What is the truth about what God wants for people? How are you going to find this? Well, you can try and say, well, I'm right, so I'm going to kill the rest of you. Well, that doesn't work out so good, and that doesn't really square with the Bible. So, what are your options? Well, at some point, you're going to have to settle down and say, well, maybe we should talk. Talking is better than killing.
Okay. So what does it mean for us to talk? Well, these aren't actually just individuals. These are clumps of individuals that have differentiation within themselves too. But what begins to happen is they start to write things that today we call confessions. And they start to write documents that, in a sense, say, I'm going to put my cards on the table
so that we can have a conversation.
Did they try to make those boil down a little bit so that, this is something that we think other people might be able to kind of flow with?
Yes, because people start believing in clumps. I mean, as much as we like to imagine ourselves as American individualists, that I see the truth purely myself and it's only me that really knows. And that's why when you go to high school, you find everyone's an individual and they're all dressing the same. It's called naive.
So what happens, so let's talk about the Belgic Confession. What's happening in, see, part of the difficulty with stuff, there's so much history impacted with this. So in Europe you have this little region called of the Netherlands, or the Low Countries, which is Belgium and what we call Holland or the Netherlands.
And this is part of the Holy Roman Empire. This is kind of garbage country. And it's garbage because it's low and the sea just keeps sweeping over it. You build a farm, there's a flood, but it's a flood of salt water, that's a disaster. Flood of fresh water, that's good.
So this area is not very organized. It's full of a lot of different little tribes. It's owned by Spain. The Reformation had come to this place, first the Anabaptists, and then later the Reformed. And so the people in this area were Protestants, but they were being, politically, they were controlled by Spain. And, well,
The rule is whoever is the political leader gets to determine the religion, and so he said, you all have to be Roman Catholic. And the people are like, I don't want to be Roman Catholic, I want to be Reformed. And so he said, I'm going to make you be Roman Catholic. They said, well, if it's whoever has the political authority gets to choose the religion, guess what? We're not only going to have our own religion, we're going to rebel so we can have our own government. Does this sound familiar, Americans? Yeah.
Was there like I'm sure there were there like political significance with that? So if they say you're going to be Catholic, does it also mean you're going to be Spanish? And so they're like, well, I don't speak Spanish. I'm not going to be Spanish.
well, and not necessarily Spanish, because
He also controlled the Holy Roman Empire. I mean, so these dynastic families owned huge, and these were incredibly diverse populations. We look at them today and say, well, they're all white, but white wasn't invented until the colonial period.
Right.
They were Frisian and Franks and Dutch and Saxons, and they were all of these little ethnic groups.
and so
These guys basically decide, we want self-determination. We want to rule our own thing. But here, the emperor here is powerful. And he sends up some pretty brutal forces to basically, make the people do what he says. Well, we saw the Iraq War. How does that go? And the U.S. didn't even try to Christianize Iraq. Didn't go well.
well, Guido de Brès,
The author of the Belgic Confession writes a letter to the emperor, which is the Belgic Confession itself. And he's not writing, it's not a declaration of independence, what Thomas Jefferson basically writes to England, saying, these are our ideas, England, stay on your side of the pond.
Guido is writing to
The Emperor of Spain saying, we're Christians too. And so what he's going to do in that document is go over
a lot of the stuff. Oh, I erased my creeds. Go over a lot of the stuff that Protestants Protestants protest. And you might say, well, here's all of the doctrine of the Roman Catholic Church. We have issues with this part. Who is Jesus? Doctrine of the Trinity, organic inspiration of Scripture. We don't think that there are 7 sacraments, we think there are 2. So that's kind of a gray area. But we're with you on most of this, and then we have this part that we disagree with. And so what he does in the Belgic Confession is he says, look at all that we have the same. We should not be killing each other. We should be saying, we're Christians together. So he temperamentally is a little different than Martin Luther. And he's not at that point, although his people are getting slaughtered by the emperor's troops. So he's saying, this is what we have the same, this is what we have different. You know, Rodney King, can't we all just get along? Do you have to kill us? And that's what the Belgic Confession comes out of. So when you read the Belgic Confession, a lot of what you're reading is stuff that the Protestants and the Catholics have in common, plus some of the elements that they don't have in common, plus, well, and some of these elements that Mark sent me an email, like, you know, everyone should go to church. The state should ensure that everyone goes to church. Well, that's in the Belgic Confession. Why is that in the Belgic Confession? Where does that idea come from? That's something both sides could agree on. They couldn't agree on which church, but that everyone should go to church and worship God is something they could agree on. Now, we read that today, and what do we think?
We think, well, you can't tell people they have to go to church.
We have, so we're way the heck over here in North America that have this patchwork of colonies, states, usually state is the whole thing. We have these little things, Canada would call them provinces, we have these states, and many of these states had their own religion. What was the religion of Massachusetts? We never think about that today, do we? What, you grew up in Massachusetts? What's the religion of Massachusetts? Who founded Massachusetts?
The Pilgrims.
The Pilgrims.
And my parents were on that boat.
The Pilgrims. And then the Puritans followed the Pilgrims. Well, they were Reformed Christians. Well, what about Roger Williams? Well, Roger spent some time in the Netherlands, and they're kind of like more free thinkers. Well, what is the Quaker state? Anybody know?
Pennsylvania.
Pennsylvania is the Quaker state. Why is it the Quaker state? Who founded Pennsylvania?
William Penn.
The Quakers. You go up through the 13 colonies, you realize they are segregated by religion. So, when they founded the United States of America, what's one of the things that they put in the Constitution?
Freedom of religion.
We are not going to kill each other over religion. Why not? Well, that's what these people were doing. So, what is a confession? Well, the confession is, in a sense, Guido de Bray saying, this is what we confess. This is what we believe. Now, it's important to kind of understand both sides of that. A confession says, this is what we believe and we want to explain it to the world. And it's also a way, well, in the context of fighting with Spain, this makes perfect sense. But now take this confession into America, where there's, in Sacramento, all kinds of little churches. And in fact, a lot of church history has happened since then, and there's a bunch of churches that say things like, no creed but Christ. What does that mean? That's part of the issue, no idea. Well, who is Christ? Was Christ a man, or is Christ fully human, fully divine?
And so what actually you see if you go to church websites, it's very interesting because almost every church website will have a little tab that says beliefs. And they have a little page that has a bunch of things, usually pretty religious and vague, because they want to keep doors open. That's a confession. Yeah.
Can't tell you how many phone calls I get or conversations where someone will say either one of two things. Either, oh, are you non-denominational?
Yeah.
Are you, please say you're non-denominational. That, or you don't have creeds, do you?
Wow.
Oh, wow.
I can't
Wow,
even tell you
yeah.
how many conversations like that.
Yet, most of those people that say that, if you would say, I think Jesus is an ascended being.
Right.
Oh, you're not a church, click. Because they have a creed implicit in their head,
Right.
but they haven't written a confession. What's the benefit then of a confession or a creed? I come up to David and said, David, I believe in Jesus. Do you believe in Jesus? Well, who's Jesus to you? Well, is Jesus fully man and fully God? Well, I don't think that matters. Oh, okay. I think it does matter. Why? Well, because I've seen what happens when Jesus is only fully God, and I see where that goes for people. And I see what happens when Jesus is only human, and I see where that goes for people. So I've actually done a little research into this, and I think it's important that he be fully man and fully God. And here's the difficulty that you face. This is just one issue. I mean, let's look at the issues that the church... Go ahead, Mark.
No, I was just about to.
Let's look at the issues that churches are fighting over today. What are the big issues that churches are fighting over today?
Music.
Homosexuality.
Music, homosexuality, women in office. There's almost nothing written about any of those things in any of these books because they weren't fighting about them. So, but there's lots of other issues. You know, let's say David comes to my church and he walks in the church, he says, where's the altar?
Yeah, where is the altar?
It's there every now
It's
and
in
then.
here.
That's right. Right away there's an entire world of history behind that question. Most Americans would say, what most Americans do is say, well, I like an altar or I don't like an altar. And what's the basis upon which they either like or don't like the altar?
What they've known.
What they've known. Well, does that connect up with anything? How can you establish a community around it? So the Belgic Confession is basically Guido de Bray trying to have a conversation with the emperor saying, we're really Christians, but we've got some disagreements on these. And they spell that out. The Heidelberg Catechism is another kind of document in the similar vein. See, for years, often when people who have grown up Roman Catholic come into the Christian Reformed Church, see, the thing is, if you grew up in a well-established church, you know some things. You've been educated. And so then we had a catechism, because catechism is basically a medieval educational tool to educate the young. Questions and answers. This gets into a whole other realm of education I'm not going to touch. But this is how you educate the young. These are the questions to ask. These are the answers to give. This is based on a view of authority and knowledge that has passed in many ways. Today you would just say, I'd like you all to have answers of your own about who is God. God to me is, well, that's fine, except we're going to have 10 gods in this room. And 3 years from now, we'd probably add 2 or 3 more different gods as some of us are changing our ideas of God. So Heidelberg Catechism goes through 10 Commandments, Apostles' Creed, sacraments, and then a few other things, and basically says, this is what we believe the Christian gospel is. And we're going to touch on some of the main teachings of Scripture that have been gone out throughout the years and some of our points of contention with the Roman Catholic Church. So you can see right away that the Heidelberg Catechism is enormously contextual. It was written with a conversation with Roman Catholic people in mind, European Roman Catholic people. That shapes the document. Canons of Dort is shaped by a whole other conflict that I don't want to get into. That is an in-house Reformed fight between Calvinists and Arminians. Not Armenians, Arminians. Armenians are somewhere else. But that's where these documents come out of. And so what has happened in the church is that the church takes these things and says, okay, we need to have continuity through history. So we have creeds. That brings us all the way back into the New Testament. And then we have confessions. That brings us through the Reformation period. And then now today, I don't know, did you have them read Our World Belongs to God? Okay. There's another book that Mark is keeping from you. And
He likes to tell us what to believe.
So here's the thing that you want to have with your church. You want to be in communion with the past. And you do that through documents. And you do that through institutions. And you do that through beliefs. And so we have the Bible. And we have the creeds. And we have confessions. And that puts us in, that gives us a narrative thread of continuity to the past. We also want continuity with people in this world. So the Christian Reformed Church in North America has these confessions. Churches that have a historical link to us have all the same confessions. Why is that handy? There's upsides and downsides to that. One of the downsides was in the 70s for the Christian Reformed Church was the Belgic Confession comes out of what today is Belgium. The Heidelberg Catechism comes out of what today is Germany. These documents put us in connection with Reformed churches all around the world from different backgrounds. These specific documents tend to be held by the Dutch Reformed communities. One of the Dutch Reformed communities went to South Africa. And there are Dutch Reformed churches in South Africa. Some of these churches developed a religious position called apartheid. Well, so we have the Dutch Reformed community in the United States, and we have the Dutch Reformed community in South Africa. And as is often true, and you won't think about this, you think, well, what do Dutch Reformed communities in South Africa look like? Well, you think they're all white. Well, that's not true, because they've been there for a couple hundred years, and so there's probably more black Dutch Reformed people in South Africa than white Dutch Reformed people in South Africa. You don't think about that, but it's true. Well, they're about to have one heck of a fight over apartheid. They're